So I'm never going to have an artist block. I'm never going to not be motivated because there's too much history as a Black man in this country that hasn't been correctly told, hasn't been correctly dealt with, hasn't been correctly acknowledged, that I could live to be 250 and still not have dealt with the expansiveness of Black history in America.
I like that. And I think it, like, that's one thing I feel that our community as a whole needs to hone in on, right? Is like there's a lot of these, I won't say myths, or I don't know the word I'm looking for, but like, oh, you shouldn't do this, or, you know, we don't necessarily like carry on, like pass the torch of knowledge down, right? Like sometimes it stops with a certain family member, or a certain public figure will idolize that person, but then once they're no longer in the limelight, then that information flow stops, right? So I just feel like as a community, as a whole, like we could do way better at uh passing on our history, teaching it to the younger generation, and but like have more outlets to do so. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and so I'm glad you said that because the one thing when we look at why history sometimes becomes stagnant, that's not by accident. I want to start by saying that. That's not by accident. Um, when we look at history as a set of facts that we have data on that has been researched, peer reviewed, documented, that's how we need to look at, analyze, and assess history. But most of the time, we're looking at history through this glorified emotional lens of memory and nostalgia. But I was born in 1967, right? So the reality is simple that Black folks in our quote unquote full inclusion into this country's democracy, since we're talking about the protection of history and passing down legacies and talking about what's important and what came before us and how we need to use that as the blueprint to move forward. Black folks have really only participated in democracy for 3 years longer than I've been born. I was born in 1967. You're talking about a Voting Rights Act in 1964. You're talking about a Civil Rights Act in 1965. I was born in 1967. Now, it's not a coincidence that I happen to be born a year after the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense was formed in Oakland in 1966. This is 2 years after a Voting Rights Act. This is 1 year after the passage of a civil rights movement, which tells you that even though we make these political and policy accomplishments, the struggle in the hood don't stop. Because if it did, there wouldn't have been no need for the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense 1966 to ever form. But it had to form. And I was born a year after that. Now I sit before you 50 some odd years later, and we are still fighting the struggle that Dr. King, Malcolm X, Bayard Rustin, Stokely Carmichael, Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, Angela Davis, Kathleen Cleaver, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, all fought. We're fighting it still today. And if you don't know those names, that means you are disconnected from the importance of a small portion of our cultural history.